the problem with the word I haven't looked for that.
Good.
Okay, welcome to the lecture on perception. Today we'll talk about the human visual system and especially how it's relevant for creating user interfaces in general and visualization in particular. But first, before we start with the theory, there's a couple of things that I want to go through first. You should have received your homework 1 grades, and not surprisingly, as homework 1 wasn't very hard, we have like a heavily skewed distribution towards full marks. So essentially, most people got more than 80% or 80 points, and actually the majority got 100 points, everything right. And then there's a couple of people who did not hand in anything. The stats, if you're, there are 70 people who have submitted the homework, there is a mean of 92.9, which is pretty high, a standard deviation of 17, and these are the quartiles. You can see that essentially at the 50% quartile, we're at 89 and 98, so it means that more than half of the class got more than 98 points. This is, by the way, done with ggplot, which is a graphing library for Python and for R, mainly for R, but also works on Python.
What library was it?
ggplot. And that's like, it's unbelievably difficult to do a histogram just with like Excel or Tableau or something like that. So you basically have to start up R or Python to do something like this. It's possible, of course, but it's not convenient. Homework 2 was due on Friday. You should get grades like by the weekend. Homework 3 has been released. It's actually not due on Friday. It's due on Saturday. And it's a little bit harder compared to what we had before. So here we have a couple of views. What you should really do is you should use the resources that we provided, and then it shouldn't be terribly hard to do. So ask on Canvas, go through the recommended readings, go through the lecture materials. If you're stuck, go to the office hours. There will also be a lab that Carolina will teach today at 4 in Meldrum conference room. That's room 2760 in this building, 2 floors, like from the 2 floors up. And there she will essentially give you an idea of what you should do where in the homework, and you can ask questions if you haven't started yet or even if you have started. But it's not like a session where you bring your computer and show her code, but it's more of like discussing generally how to approach things.
And they are going to record it too.
And yeah.
So for anyone who can't make it?
It will be videotaped if you can't make it, but it's I think it's more interesting if you go there and ask questions. So I kind of wanted to show you quickly how homework 3 looks. The data of homework 3 is FIFA World Cup statistics from 1930 till 2014. So this has 3 different components. So we have a side panel here that gives us textual information, a bar chart that visualizes different attributes, and then we have a map. And so here we can switch between these different attributes. So we can switch, for example, to how many teams participated, and you can see that the World Cup was expanded in 1998. We can see how many matches were played. Again, unsurprisingly, we have this expansion that plays a big role here. The number of goals and the average attendance. So what we can see here is that the US games were the most attended in history on average, which was surprising for me at first, but then I figured it's probably because the US has a lot of big stadiums. Yeah?
Because it's because the US.
What's that?
I said it's because the US rocks.
Well. That too, but not in soccer. But people like it. And then when I select any of those particular World Cup instances, you can see that here here all of the information changes. You see which teams participated, the host country, the winner, the silver medalist, and you also see that on the map. On the map we have a color coding for the host and participants, and then we have a silver medal and the gold medal associated with the countries. So it's pretty straightforward to use, and it should be not too hard to do. Carolina also wanted to do a quick introduction or a quick recap of maps now in the lecture, not in the lab, just because she thought there's a couple of concepts that everybody could benefit from if she would talk about them now. So, do you want to come up, Carolina?
Okay. Hello everyone. So last time I noticed watching back the recording that the slides were really small in the video, so for people who are watching remotely or if you're in the back and can't see it that great, I did post an announcement on Canvas with the slides, so you can follow along there. Alex did the same thing last time, but just officially so you know that you can always go back and look at them there or now when I'm going through it. Okay, so we did talk about maps last time, but it was pretty brief, so I did want to go over a few key things that you guys are going to need for the homework. So d3.geopath is a path generator, right? And so it is equivalent to, say, d3.line or other d3.shapes, right? And it will create the map for you, but it needs an input for that. So if you give it an object, it will draw that path for you. Now that input can either be a GeoJSON feature or just a geometry object, right? So it can be either the GeoJSON feature is going to be something more like along the lines of a map, and the geometry object can be like a line or something like that. So these are the things that you can give into d3.geopath that it will draw or give you the coordinates that you can then render onto your SVG. So the ones that aren't in orange are the geometry objects, and then here we have features. Features and feature collection. Now all of this we looked at last class, but I kind of wanted to point out, what is a feature? How is a feature different from a geometry object? So a feature pretty much contains geometry objects plus a little bit more information. So it has other properties. So let's see what that looks like. So this is a GeoJSON file. This is from the lecture notes, right? So you can see that if you go through. And you see that it has that geometry in here, which has coordinates and a type, but it also has other properties. In this case, the name of the state that it represents, an ID, so the name is a feature. So it's pretty much just like a casing inside which we have a geometry. And so you can have one feature, or you can have a whole bunch of them in a feature collection. This is what the file looks like if you would open up in an editor. What does it look like if you in the console? So if you do a console.log, so this is just a very simplified version, right? You're reading in this JSON file, and all that your function is doing is printing it out to the console. So here you have the type is feature collection, and inside you have an array of features. So there are 52. And if we open up that object, you see that you have the geometry and you have the properties. And if you open that up further, your geometry has your coordinates, your properties has the same thing you had in the file, but this is the way it looks in the console. So far nothing new, we've looked at this. But I want to use this as a segue, actually, to the next bit, but I forgot that we have this here. So this is where, when you're drawing it, you give it the data, you give it the features within the JSON object. So what you need to feed it in is this array of features, and that is going to allow you to draw the paths. So that's GeoJSON. We mentioned TopoJSON, but very briefly, and as it turns out, the data object, the file that we gave you for homework 3 is a TopoJSON file. And it's similar to the GeoJSON, but it does require a little bit more manipulating. So I thought it was worth just showing you so people don't spend too much time figuring out what the difference is between TopoJSON and GeoJSON. Now D3 can't deal directly with TopoJSON, so in order for us to use it, we need to make it into a GeoJSON, right? And the way we do that is using this library, which we have included in the HTML file that we give you, has it at the top. So it's a TopoJSON library. We're going to use one of its functionalities to extract the features for us to feed into data. So let's first look at what is TopoJSON. So Definition in the documentation for Mike's TopoJSON library, it is a topological geospatial data interchange format based on GeoJSON. What that means is it's a more efficient way of encoding GeoJSON files. And so that has a whole bunch of consequences, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main idea is it's a smaller file because it's more efficient in encoding geographic data. So it doesn't re-encode two boundaries that are shared, for example, it'll encode it once, and then it outputs those as something called arcs. Now, you don't need to know all these details, but you just need to understand why do we use TopoJSON. It's just more efficient for huge amounts of geographic data. So if you do a console.log on the data that you're going to read into on the homework 3, this is what it's going to look like. So the type of object is now a topology object, which is what is read in from TopoJSON, and it has an array of objects. If we open it up, you see that, let me go back one. So you have the arcs that I just told you about. You don't really care about those. You have objects, and you have a transform. So the transform is pretty much the attributes of scale and translation. The objects, in this case, you have an array of countries. If we're going to open that up one more, you're going to see that the countries are composed of geometries. That is an array with 253 different geometries. Now, this geometry collection, if you recall back to when I first gave you the list of things you can feed into GeoPath, is one of the geometric objects. So D3 knows how to deal with this. It doesn't know how to deal with everything else. So we just need to make this into something we can feed into Path, to geo.path. And that's where we're going to use the TopoJSON library. So it's an API that supports converting from TopoJSON into GeoJSON, so you can use it in your web browser. So the one functionality of TopoJSON that you need to be comfortable with is TopoJSON.feature. As you can imagine, it will extract features from a TopoJSON object. And that's the syntax, topology and object. In this case, topology is pretty much just the data as it came in. So you read in your world.json, and you're going to feed it into here. So that's the topology. Now the object is the array of objects that you want to extract features for. So let me go back here real quick. So here you're looking at what the console.log spit out is of all of your TopoJSON file. And what we really want, so the objects has another array called countries, but this is the objects that we want, the ones that are embedded inside countries. This is going to give you a different object for each country, which is why it's json.objects.countries. Now we're still one step away from really being able to give this to the .data operator. The data operator doesn't take a whole bunch of features, right? If you look at what this looks like in the console, this is a feature collection because there's one feature per country. So we need to give it all of the features. So when you remember that data takes in features, not a feature collection. So when you're actually going to feed this into data, you're going to feed what we just said, .features. And you're going to come up with this beautiful map, and you're done. Do show up for the homework lab if you're around. I feel like understanding the code that we've given you and what's expected of you is a really important first step before you can start figuring out how to do what we expect of you. I felt like with homework 2, there were a lot of questions where you don't really understand what we're giving you and what you're supposed to do with it. Like Alex said, it's better if you go because you can ask questions, but if you can't make it because you have another class, we are going to record it. But then there's the downside that you can't raise your hand and say, I didn't understand this or that.
Good, thank you very much. So let's start with some basic theory. This class is probably going to be the most entertaining of all because it's just so easy to fool our visual system. It's also going to be a lot of content, and my guess is that I will not finish it today, and I will continue next week if I don't. So what is the difference between perception and cognition first? So perception is the identification and interpretation of sensory information. Basically, we take the physical stimulus to recognize information. And this, like our perception is shaped by learning, by memory, and by our expectation. So it's not just this pure image processing, but it has this aspect of learning, memory, and expectation. In contrast to that, however, it's still lower level than cognition. Cognition is the processing of information when we want to apply knowledge. And my favorite distinction, for example, if you hear someone speak, for example, in a language that you don't know, that would be perception. But if you understand the language and the words and listen to the meaning, this is cognition. So this is the difference between those two here. So perception is really about the eye, the optical nerve, the visual cortex, the basic perception, first processing, segmenting edges, shapes, planes, and it's something that is not conscious. Like we simply continuously perceive. Cognition is about recognizing objects. Like I know that this is a bottle, but for perception this is just like a red thing that is standing there. It's about relationships between objects. So I understand what is going on. This bottle has liquid in it. I can use it to drink. It's about drawing conclusions. It's about problem solving and about learning. And so today the lecture will be, I would say, like 70% on perception and 30% on cognition, because cognition is, of course, something that is like pretty complex to talk about. This is also like a good illustration of a difference between perception and cognition, right? So if you read this and if you match it to the color, like the color matching is what you would perceive, and then if you think about it, what does it mean? Like what do you give priority? Do you give the word or the color priority? Then this is cognition. So here are just a couple of examples of perception and understanding, and also like a couple of funny things that simply our eyes trick us. So one of the things that like, who can see something in this picture? Okay, of those of you who can see something, have you seen this picture before?
Yes.
Yes. Can anybody who hasn't seen this picture before see anything? Yes, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I'm going to tell you there's a Dalmatian, a dog. Here's its head, here the legs, and then here's the body. So this is the effect of emergence. And now, like, if you have seen it once, you will be always able to see it. Like, that's called perceptual hysteresis. So now, like, if you've seen this picture before, you will see the dog immediately. And so, can anybody see something here? Yeah? Okay, so here is an elephant. So the interesting thing about these, like this is actually, like there's a link later on this slide, this is actually a computer-generated emergence picture, which was a SIGGRAPH paper. And the interesting thing about these emergence pictures, they only work if we, like here we can see, if we do like a proper rendering of this, a 3D rendering, if we just see this segment here, we can still recognize it's an elephant. Or if we see this segment here, we can still recognize it's an elephant. But if we do this for these emergent patches, and so here we see the same patches, that doesn't work at all. So for these emerging features to pop out, you actually have to see the whole, and that's where like your brain essentially processes this to be one picture. And so here's the link if you want to generate those images. You can use it based on the technique shown in this paper. Here are a couple of other like illustrations. Like this one here is particularly nice. We have the 3D effect that is painted on the side walk. So we rely on, like, what we see here is essentially we assume that this human has like normally shaped proportions, and that's why we perceive it three-dimensional. But of course we like from the right angle only, and if you look at it from the wrong angle, it is simply like a clever trick of playing your mind. Here are a couple of other funny pictures where we simply, or something doesn't quite work the way we expect it to work. Then we also have a tendency to see faces when there are none. So you probably all have heard of the famous toast with the face of Jesus. So here is, for example, like chairs that look sad. We have like a contemplating toast, deep fryer. We have a terrified pickle, and then we have like a little excited face here. The reason behind that is we're primed to perceive human faces and other people. So why am I showing you this kind of stuff? It's not going to apply directly to visualization, but you should understand that vision is constructed top-down from the input. So what you see when you see a thing depends on what the thing is, but what you see the thing as depends on what you know about what you're seeing. So, like, just think about what the people that you're designing for know, what they expect, and simply design accordingly. So like a little bit, very shallow introduction to some biological background here. Like visualization is concerned with creating images, and images are perceived through the eye. And so this is the standard picture that you would probably have seen in high school or like in middle school biology. You have the lens. What is kind of interesting is the retina, the optical nerve, the foeva, the point of the sharpest vision, and then here we have the blind spot where the optical nerve exits the eye. This is not super, like you don't have to know any details about this, but the interesting distinction here is between cones and rods. So we have about 5 or 6 million cones which are responsible for color vision, and if you don't remember which one of those is responsible for color vision, just say cones is color. It starts the same way. Cones are responsible for color vision, and they are really dense in the center. So like if here is kind of a linearized plot of the eye from outside, like in the angle from the foeva, and you can see that at the foeva, fovea, we have the most cones in there. So we have 27 times the density in the fovea. So this is responsible for the sharp central vision, and it's mainly done by cone cells, or only done by cone cells. We have a lot more rods, which are responsible for black and white vision. So here is like an interesting illustration about this. This is what the cones look like. So like they look somewhat like a cone, and the rods look like a cone. That's where they have their names from. So like just like a microscopy picture of the same thing, and then here is a distribution of cones which are responsible for each of these colors. And you can see that there's a lot fewer blue cones than red cones, and we'll see also that blue is the color that we perceive like with the least precision. And so here is like a juxtaposition that we had this picture earlier, how many cones are in the fovea. And so here is like, if you look at the whole eye and juxtapose rods versus cones, you can see that there's like very few cones outside of the fovea, but a lot of rods actually outside of the fovea. And then here we have the blind spot. And this is like a figure of these cones. They're not like just one signal. They kind of like more have like they perceive light at a certain intensity, but it doesn't mean that 446 nanometers is not perceived as strongly, but it means that we have, like here in this space between blue and green, we perceive a little bit weaker than we do, for example, on any of those peaks or between those two peaks. One interesting observation, I don't know whether you're aware of this, is that like while you perceive the whole world as sharp and constant, it is actually more of like an ongoing construction project. So if I were to freeze your gaze in 1 second, this is basically, if you looked at a spreadsheet, this is what you would be seeing. So you see one thing sharply, but then you move your eyes quickly around to see everything else and then to construct a picture. So vision works as a sequence of fixations and saccades. Like these fixations is when we actually perceive something, and the saccades, they're rapid eye movements. And so like saccades are pretty fast, 20 to 100 milliseconds. And one thing that is important to notice is vision is not similar to a camera, right? In a camera, we usually have everything sharp. Vision is not like that. So vision is like if we watched this video and looked at this person, we would see it like this. If we watched this person, we would see it like this. We wouldn't see both of them sharp at the same time. We only have that illusion because we can quickly move between those objects. And so here on this picture shows you a recording of where people looked at when they looked at this picture. This was recorded with an eye tracker, and I have a couple of videos for that. But first let me show you how such an eye tracker works. The eye tracker, like this is the classical setup. What you have is you have an infrared camera that shines into your eyes. Then you have some stimulus. Then in this case here is a visualization. And then you have a control computer that exactly records the position of your eye and can essentially, by using computer vision, can determine where you looked at at which time. And so the classical setup, what you still used in psychology, if it's really about neuroscience, then you would have like a headrest in this uncomfortable setting. This is what you would do, like this is what you would do if you wanted to study low-level visual system properties. But modern tools like this camera here, or this glasses here, you can actually walk around them and they will look at, like for example, if you're browsing in a supermarket, people will track where you're looking at and will make matches and like which products, for example, are interesting or attractive to you. And this is like a device that is, for example, great to use in user studies for visualization. So this is like the simpler version of this. It is accurate enough for everything that you could want to do, but it's not quite as accurate as a setup like this. But these are commercial tools. You can buy them. You can run your program through it, and then you get the outputs. So let me show you these videos. They don't play in Keynote directly, so that's why I'm showing you this. So here is like for multiple people, when they look at a video, where they're looking at. And so one thing that you will notice is that people tend to look at big labels, tend to look at faces, at eyes. And so nobody's looking on the right somewhere here, but they're kind of looking at the center and trying to grasp what is going on.
Is that an aggregate of everyone's eyes?
That's an aggregate, yes. This now is an individual. Brave participant. So what is interesting to note here is like how we read, right? We essentially move our eye focus, the fixations quickly, but we can grasp a word. Like we don't have to look at the beginning of an E, but we rather move our eye, our gaze to one word, take that in, and then move on to the next word. So here, like the human visual system, and I'm just going to keep it like this for a second, is something that is not like a general purpose system, but we can be fooled pretty well actually. So this is what's called an Ames room. So there's no video editing here.
How does that work? No.
So the point here is that what we see depends on what we expect. And we don't expect a room that has a weird shape like this here. We expect a room that has like regular corners and that is of constant height. So our visual system like depends a lot on what we have learned in the past about the world. And if we fool it like this, we have a hard time recognizing it. And so this can be called an optical illusion, but I just saw a video earlier, Neil deGrasse Tyson called it, it's not optical illusions, it's brain failures. And I kind of like the term because somehow like our brain simply doesn't get that right. Okay, So one of the things that we'll also talk about next lecture, or in 2 lectures, when we talk about all the different ways of to encode data, is color. But color, I really want to treat it separately from a perceptual point of view because it's just so important and so tricky. So color is the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum from 390 to 750 nanometers. And we have like these pure spectral colors that are evoked by a single wavelength. And all of the other colors that are not in the electromagnetic spectrums are unsaturated colors and mixes of multiple wavelengths. So here is like an example, and you've also seen this in physics, in high school physics. We have ultraviolet light, and we have this very narrow area of visible light, and then we have infrared light. More interesting for the purpose of visualization is the different dimensions of color. So we have hue, saturation, and value. And so hue is really like which color it is, which wavelength. Saturation describes the purity of a color, like from like how pure is, like here we have like no saturation, and then we increase the saturation constantly until we have 100% saturation in the 3 cases. And then the value or luminance or brightness, but we'll be using the term value, is the lightness or the darkness of a color. So typically high saturation colors have medium values. And so this is important because we could, in theory, like what we have here is we could use this spectrum to encode continuous data, or we could use a spectrum like this. And we'll see later which one is actually the better choice. And so the color models, what I really wanted to show you with this slide is we have these chromaticity diagrams which specify the color along this gamut here out here. So this is where the pure colors are of the visible spectrum along the curve in terms of the wavelength. And so you've probably seen this if you, for example, looked at the properties of which colors your monitor can display. And what then is typically shown is the gamut, the set of all the colors that can be produced by a device. So what happens is if I have a 3-pixel, like a 3-color display, I can essentially pick my 3 points, the 3 pixels somewhere in this gamut in here, and then I get the area that I can represent with this particular device. So if I show you something like this, I'm not actually able to show all of the colors that are in this like conceptual diagram on this screen, because the screen simply doesn't have the capability to do that. It's more like this, like we have one blue color, we have one red pixel, and then we have one green pixel, and we can interpolate between them. And so here's a couple of examples of different devices and color standards. And notice that with print color you can actually get, you can use more than 3 dyes, for example, and get a non-triangular shape. There's 2 ways of compositing color. The standard one that we use when we use computer displays is additive. So like this projection here uses additive color display that's based on light. That would be the RGB space. So white is when all 3 cones are stimulated in our eye with the same intensity at a high brightness. And then we have subtractive color composition where we assume an external light source and simply apply a pigment. That's what we would do in printing, for example. We apply a black pigment so that it reflects, or any kind of pigment so that it reflects with a certain property. And so here is the difference, like if we have red, green, and blue, and combine all of them at the same intensity, we get white. And if we have pigments like yellow, magenta, and cyan, and we combine all of them, we get the dark or black area here. So here in this case, we're adding colors by light, and here we're subtracting color using pigments which are inks, and that works by absorbing the respective light sources. So why do any of you have an idea, why do we actually have color vision? It's not something that we need to rely on, right? You can be perfectly lead a healthy life without knowing anything about colors. The theory from an evolutionary point of view is that it kind of helps to break camouflage. So for example, it would be easy to pick out the berries in this example. And it also tells us about material properties. So if you want to see whether an apple is rotten, we can see that with color. It's much harder to do it just with grayscale images. So that's the theory of why we have developed color vision. Like one of the problems with color is that it is not very, like we are good at seeing a lot of colors, but we are then not so great at distinguishing them. So this is like one of the not so great graphs that are out there. This is a network of the, like a visualization of the internet in 2002. It would be of course a little way more complex by now, but here they use 22 different colors to represent different subparts of the network. They use 5 different green hues here to distinguish something that is completely different and not related at all. And so you now are able to see, okay, this one is lighter than this one, but that's only because they're next to each other. Like if I had this dark light, this green here, and this green here, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So for color labeling, for nominal information encoding, it's recommended to use about 6 colors at most. Don't usually use more than 10. There is this great tool, which is called Color Brewer. These are carefully designed color schemes for up to 12 colors. You can go there, and I'll bring this up again at a later point in the lecture, but they really thought about many different things of how to pick the color scales for the different data attributes. So this was for labeling, for nominal data, but what about continuous data, quantitative data? So one of the classical mistakes is to use the spectral color, the rainbow color map, to encode this color. Like we simply use the wavelength of the light to encode some continuous variable. This was for a long time the default setting, for example, in MATLAB, and so we have lots of science pictures that use this rainbow color scale. So the problem is with using value is that we get, like this would be the saturation or lightness variety. We see there's a completely continuous increase from white to dark. In the rainbow color scale, we get these like sharp boundaries. So we would think that, okay, here's something, here's something, here's a feature, here's a feature. So they introduce boundaries or they introduce gradients where there are none. Like if you look at this example here, this is again a continuous example, but it actually looks like a couple of circles. So don't use hue to encode continuous values, use value or saturation instead. So here's an example of a flow visualization that uses value in this case, and we can see there is clearly, we can see all the subtleties here, where you can see the peaks, the maxima easily in the rainbow color map, but we're not very good at, like, it's hard to perceive that this green out here is just like a little bit smaller than whatever it surrounds. We have these artificial gradients in here that we do want to avoid. Here are a couple of more examples of how the rainbow color map tends to distort things. And so people actually studied this explicitly. Here is an image of where people had to distinguish the change between 2 points, and they did it with a luminance color scale. And you can see that while in the very dark area there was quite a bit of error, it was like the error afterwards was pretty constant. So you can see this is basically a curve like starting here. Like if you have a data increase, we can see that like the error is pretty low. If you do that with the rainbow color scale, the error is actually very high at these edges, at these gradients here. So like this is empirical evidence that these rainbow color scales can be can be a problem for thresholding. So another question when you want to plot continuous variables is, do you bin or don't you bin? So cartographers usually like to do like these binned shadings, whereas data visualization researchers usually say just plot it continuously because then we can see all the data. Of course, this is still binned by the capability of the device that can display it, but the binning is very fine-grained. So here we have like a pretty, like we have 10 different bins, and here we have like many different bins, like a couple of hundred bins. So, what do you think? What is faster? What is more accurate?
So the binning is definitely going to be faster, but I mean in terms of accuracy, you're losing a lot of
Yeah. Any other opinions?
I would say like you can only perceive, like you're saying, you only perceive so many differences, and so I honestly think that bidding might actually be, in a sense, more accurate, is because you, like all the in-between shades, like how much information am I going to give your eye, like how much can you make sense of it?
Yeah. Thanks.
I'd say it depends on how you're bidding it. Like if we're talking about fish that for some reason only stay in depths that range between 0 and 10 feet, then it makes sense to bid, because then we know, okay, that exact shade is where those fish live.
So this is like the perfect answer. Like it's task dependent, and there's so much in visualization is task dependent. But in this case, like if you only look at the like raw perceptual study, and this was actually a study that was done in our group by Sam Quinnan and his colleagues. And so the cartographers usually say, well, this is faster to perceive, and visualization researchers usually said this is more precise. And it turns out that, like in this elevation example, continuous was faster, which is counterintuitive, but binned was often more accurate. So 50% of the time the binning was about as accurate. It was never less accurate. But in 50% of the cases it was actually more accurate because people could do an explicit matching of the labels.
Sorry, you mean faster to perceive or faster to generate?
Faster in response, like how long, like take as much time as you want, give us the best answer that you can, how long does it take you to give the answer? That was what was measured in the study. And this is a paper that is going to come out in the fall, will be presented at a conference. Okay, so this design critique that I want to do now is also related to color. So you can go to the source page that's at the bottom there, if you brought a computer, because it's also interactive. By the way, the other one still doesn't work. No, there's a couple left here. There's probably some left back there. Okay, so this is a visualization about the 2013 Obama budget. This is crazy, I checked it earlier. Okay, something is wrong with the times I've set, but I think this one we can actually do without interaction. So none of the interactive graphics work right now. But basically, take a look at this and we'll discuss it in a couple of minutes. Okay, so what is the visual encoding that we see in this chart? What is the data? How is it encoded?
The sizes through circles.
Yes, the size of the budget position is visualized through the size of the circle. What else? Anybody?
Would this be an appropriate time to say saturation? Is this a saturation change?
It is. Saturation plays a role here. We have a neutral value of here, like a 0, and then here we have a saturation change in 2 directions, right?
Okay, so the saturation compares 2013 to 2012.
Yes, exactly. So the saturation for positive values shows like a positive change, and for negative values we use a different hue, but also we use saturation and encode quantitative data. So far so good. That it kind of like follows roughly the principles that we mentioned. Anything else here in the data that is encoded? How is the data, another way of the data encoded?
So also on the vertical axis, it's encoding how much something is increased.
Yes,
Not
exactly.
necessarily increasing, but decreasing, but
Yeah, we have a position. Do you think this is a precise encoding?
I think it's kind of confusing to get a smaller budget, like our large budget with a small increase means a lot more money than a small budget with a large increase.
That is true.
Percentage.
So we have these relative values which can fluctuate a lot in smaller positions. But so I want to go back to the positioning here. What do you think this positioning is exact? Can I read that this here is higher or lower than this here?
No, just the nature of those shapes and the layout. I don't
Yeah.
think you can possibly.
So if this were not broken again, which is really disappointing, then we would see that this is a force-directed graph. So we have a force system here that brings those shapes at these positions, but it's not like we can precisely say this is the value based on positioning. Okay, so if you look at this second bubble, so what is different here of the second panel? Any comments?
is it the same as the first one, just broken down, less spread?
Yes, pretty much.
I feel like it's hard to interpret, area, like we were talking about. Area is hard to interpret because you've got the change and the actual size of that category going on, and so it's really hard to interpret the area channel.
Yeah, that is correct. So area isn't the best visual channel.
There's circles that are inside of each other, and I don't know if that means it's a sub-budget or if they're just put on top of each other, and I don't think that's clear.
Yeah, so the order here is critical, of course, because only the smaller circles on top of the larger circles work. We have overlapping circles. Why didn't they make them non-overlapping?
Because it corresponds to the y-axis.
Yeah, so there is, in this case, we actually have an absolutely meaningful y-axis. So we have a redundant encoding of color, red and green, 25% increase, a 25% decrease, and we can see that these positions have a precise meaning in this case. One other thing that is missing from this chart compared to this one, where are the two big blobs here? So this is only discretionary spending. And this is, probably retirement and health insurance and social security and so on, which is not discretionary, yes?
So what does the x-axis actually mean?
So the x-axis are various departments, but that is basically impossible to see without interaction, just in a static version. Okay. Any other comments on this panel? There's of course nice transitions between that if you have it interacted yet.
I have one that sort of applies to all of them, and I'm not sure that they're using this very much or if it was intentional or not, but it seems to me that with the specific colors green and red, there's usually a good and bad connotation with green is usually perceived as a good thing and red is a bad thing, and they could swap which ones were green and which ones are red if they wanted to make something look better or look worse.
So, a conservative newspaper would swap the colors, you say, and the liberal newspaper has it like this. Yeah, that's a good point. I like that idea. And so there's one more panel here. This is now ordered by departments, which was hard to see earlier. Any comments on this one?
I can't tell if for example, the first group is 921.6 billion. I can't tell if that's the amount of money total that is there or the amount of money that has changed. We get I guess I could add it up to see if it adds up to 3.7 trillion. but without
Yeah.
adding it up myself, I can't tell if that's like how much got increased or if that's just how much period.
Yeah, that's true. It's also in this particular case also hard to see whether this is the label for this one bubble, right? Or the whole department. But in this case, it's the whole department, and I think it's also the sum of the values, not the change. So one thing that I particularly dislike about this chart, has anyone spotted something weird? Yeah, empty circle shows income. So that is really your problem. Like we perceive something as bigger, but it's actually income. So somehow that isn't really quite right. So any general comments? Do you like or dislike this visualization?
Kind of like this last one that separates it by department, especially because how you can contrast, for example, defense and education, such a drastic. I mean, in its detail, it might not work as intended, but from a very holistic, aerial perspective, it kind of gives a good idea of where the money's going.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I almost kind of like the empty circles, because I could see, okay, if the empty circle was bigger than the area approximately of the other ones, I could say, okay, that's probably a better area to be. I'm assuming that's what it means, right? That's not entirely.
What do you mean with a better area to be?
So if our income, if that area of income is bigger than the spending in the other area, that would mean that we're balancing out our.
But then still you would have to add up mentally 15 bubbles and then compare it to the one bubble. So
Of course, right?
Yeah.
But in this I can say, okay, we're roughly a third or so. It's not exact, definitely.
Yeah.
I think you can't, going back to the first comment, I don't think you can always tell which departments are spending more money than others because of those empty circles. Like defense has a huge, not defense, the health and human services has a huge one that we're spending on, but it also has a huge income. And so I have no idea how that balances out because I can't add it mentally.
Yeah.
And so I can't compare that to anything smaller.
I think one difficulty with circles is the idea of radius versus area. And sometimes it's hard to perceive what exactly is a tenth or what exactly is half.
Yeah.
Right? Because the radius is not exactly. So
That's a very good point, and we'll talk more about this in the lecture on different margin channels. That's a very good point. Circles, the size of circles is hard to compare exactly.
The empty circle is also around the color code.
Yep.
Which is not really easy to get.
That is true. This is really hard to see. So here we have to look at the line to see whether it has an increase in income or decrease in income. Okay, so I'll also tell you my opinion. I think this is actually a pretty good chart. It's not perfect, and it does a lot of things wrong, but for a newspaper, it's pretty engaging, and especially what I like is these transitions between the charts, which you cannot see. By simply clicking on these various things, we see how we can slice and dice a data set. We get a better feeling of how we can represent the same data in different ways. There are lots of arguments to be made against it, and I'm going to make one formally later. Circle size is a problem, the bubbles and so on. People somehow like circles. People are attracted to circles. We have all these bubbles popping up in designed visualizations. Of course, this would be perceptually more efficient if we did our bar chart. So many design studies, design cases we will be looking at, you could always make an argument for this could be better done with a bar chart, but not everything has to be a bar chart, of course. So I kind of like it. It's not perfect. There's one particular thing that I don't like about it, which is the color coding, the particular choice of color coding, red and green. Why could that be problematic, other than the cultural aspect of it, which we already mentioned? Exactly. Color blindness. So, color blindness is something that affects about 10% of all males and only 1% of females, which is probably due to X chromosomal recessive inheritance. So, the gene that is responsible for color perception is in a segment of the Y chromosome that males only have one copy for. So therefore, color blindness is more common in males than in females. And so if you think about it, 10% of all populations, if you think about the New York Times, probably like 2 million people or so read such an article. This is a lot of people that cannot accurately perceive this. And so there's a couple of different ways like people can be colorblind. Red-green weakness or blindness is the most common one, so that is kind of 9.5 out of those 10% are red-green weaknesses. And the reason here is the lack of a medium or long wavelength receptors or altered spectral sensitivity of those receptors. And so here's, if we had a rainbow flag, how that would look like if you don't have any green receptors, and how that would look like if you had any no red receptors. And so it's really hard to pick those apart, and then of course in this case it's really hard to tell green and red apart. So it's actually impossible to tell green and red apart. You can test people for color blindness. So like if you don't mind, like what's this number? Yep.
15.
Okay, and then up here.
6, 26, 73, 27,
45, right? So anybody, like you don't have to say it, but anybody cannot read everything? So there should be a couple of red-green weak people in here. So not everybody should be able to see everything. But anyway, so this is like the test that you would do if you, for example, run a user test that uses color. You would, for example, exclude people that don't have perfect color vision just to avoid any biases.
I have a question going back to those. Is there a cutoff where you say, like, you can't read this, or is it like a gradual thing? Because I can see the 73, but it took me a minute to decide that it wasn't 23, whereas the 12 is obvious to me.
There's quite a lot, like there's a long spectrum. So you can be completely colorblind, or you can have like a slight weakness. By the way, traffic lights are consistently positioned, like red on top, green at the bottom, so that this is not a problem for colorblind people. So yes, there is, and most people are not completely red-green blind, but most people have like a slight weakness. And so, like, I don't think I'm colorblind, but I also have a hard time of seeing the 73 here. So like these tests are made tricky. This one here is not very tricky, but the other ones are pretty tricky. Here are a couple of more examples of how people perceive that with these specific deficiencies, the perceived images like this. And so here's like from this chart that we saw earlier, there's tools that, and I'll show you one later, but there's tools that can take a screenshot or a website and then render it such that you would perceive it the way a colorblind person perceives it. And so you can see that here, between those two circles, you now have no idea of this is an increase or a decrease. And so therefore this is like a not very well designed chart for this particular reason. Here's another example. We can basically pick apart the labels on the left here, even though that's a lot, but then here, up here, it gets pretty, like all of those green lines look essentially the same. So the point here is really that you should be conscious about when you pick colors to pick them in a way that work also for colorblind people. You can simulate these color vision deficiencies. There's two different tools here. I have used this this Call Blindor. This is Call Blindness Simulator to simulate our homework. And so if you're completely colorblind and only see in black and white, we have failed you, because you can see here we have the red bar highlighted, but it's not easy, it's impossible to pick this apart here. So if we were to design for this class of people, which is kind of rare, so you will be excused if you don't do that, then like this wouldn't be good, so we would need to use like a value difference, not a hue difference. Here is blue blind, and here is red blind. And these charts, they look a little bit weird, but everything that you need to be able to read, you are able to read. And so this is a way of testing this. So let me like briefly mention the differences between luminance, brightness, and lightness. This is not particularly important for visualization, but I should mention it because it's always something that, like, I guess it's not something like conventional knowledge. Luminance is the measured amount of light that's like luminous intensity per area. Brightness is the perceived amount of light, and lightness is the perceived reflectance of a surface, the lightness of a color. So you don't say, if you want to be like very picky about your language, you don't say this color is bright, but you say this color is light. But yeah, just for completeness sake. One thing to note is that color and also contrast is not absolute. So we perceive, because we live in a world where we have different light sources, we perceive things quite differently depending on what is going on around us. So here we have the same color shade with a different, like a gradient background. And you would perceive this one here to be much darker than this one, when in fact it is actually of the same darkness. We have, this is also more apparent in this called Chevreul illusion. So we have these gradients, and these are hard gradients here, like they're steps, but we perceive it with these like edges. These kind of edges glow a little bit when we look at them. And so that's what's called like this edge enhancement, which is called the Korn-Sweet effect. So here in this picture, in this painting, we can see that this was consciously used to essentially make the object stand out. And so we can, like, here is another example to make objects more distinct. This can be an issue if you're in computer graphics, for example. You might, well, like if you have these, like if you render something in computer graphics, it's never completely continuous. So you have discrete shapes that you need to shade. And so if you simply did uniform shading, you would have a luminous profile like this with steps, but it would actually be even like worse, because you perceive through this Korn-Sweet effect, you perceive these edges very strongly. If you do Gouraud shading, this is a little bit better, because we have the luminous profile here is more continuous, but we still have these effects. And if you use Phong shading, we have a continuous luminous profile, and therefore also a continuous perceived luminous profile. Here is an example. Which of those two is darker? Who thinks the top one is darker? Okay. Who thinks the bottom one is darker? Who thinks they're the same? They are the same. So this is just because, like, we have an understanding of how shadow works, and so we kind of infer the light source here. And so if we add this thing that removes the 3D aspect of it, the shading aspect of it, we see that those two colors are actually exactly the same. So there is a couple of demos here. So those two are the same. Here you see the dancing ball, and it looks like as if it were getting darker and then getting lighter again. But what happens in fact is it stays exactly the same all the time. So it's just the background that is kind of distracting us here. And so here's this example. There's like, especially in these scenarios, we simply make so many inferences about the 3D scene that it's just completely, almost impossibly hard for us to correctly perceive the color. So one of the problems, for example, of 3D visualization is color perception, because we always have to take into account the lighting and the shading. So there's more examples, but I'll let you play with those yourself. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes I want to talk pretty briefly about pre-attentive processing, because it's an important property. So pre-attentive processing is about, this is about properties detected by the low-level vision system, things that stand out very quickly and in parallel. So this whole idea of this is pre-attentive is like a simplification. In reality, there is a spectrum of how fast we perceive something, but for the purpose of this classes, we will simply say there are certain aspects of a scene that can be pre-attentive, where we don't have to think about it and quickly identify it. So this is very rapid, 250 milliseconds. It's very accurate, and it's processed in parallel. So this is what happens before focused attention. And we will see later, or next time, that attention is very important for cognition, but for pre-attentive properties, we actually don't need it. So one other thing is it's independent of the number of distractors, but maybe let's just do an example before I talk too much about formal definitions. So everybody in this room was able to spot the red circle immediately. Even if I drew like 5 times as many blue dots here, you would still be able to spot the red circle immediately. And that is a pre-attentive property here. The difference in hue, this is very, very easy for us to pick out. This is independent of the number of distractors, and the opposite of it is a sequential search process. So if I had to visit mentally every single node here and think about, is this one red, is this one red, is this one red, is this one red, then we would have serial search. So if you're looking for a word in a page, like in a text, like in a file or on paper, you would have to do serial search. The word what doesn't pop out pre-attentively. You have to read every word and identify what at this particular point. Here is another one. Who can spot the difference? Okay, so quite a few of you were able to spot this very quickly. And so now let's do an example. I show you a couple of pictures. You clap when you see the one odd element, okay? Sorry. Okay, let's do this again. So pre-attentive properties, they work isolated. They don't work in combinations. Like the red circle isn't pre-attentive. The squares are pre-attentive, or the color is pre-attentive, but the red circle is not pre-attentive. So you had quite a hard time picking out the red circle here. So this is not valid for combinations. Conjunction targets is not a unique visual property. The distractor objects here have both properties. Here is like a list of other pre-attentive properties. Like we had the orientation, then we have length, we have closure, we have size, we have curvature, we have the density. So here is a cluster. We have hue. This one here is value, but this is a little hard to pick up on this projector. Flicker is broken in Keynote, but this is supposed to flicker, and this is supposed to move, but those GIFs don't render properly here. Not to some degree, not quite properly. So why is this important? The tasks that you could do is target detection, detect the presence or absence of a target. So for example, if you were to search for a word in your browser and you pushed in this word in the search box, and it should light up in red, and then it's easy to spot it. For boundary detection, so if you want to distinguish where there is a boundary between two groups of elements, for region tracking, or for counting and estimation. So for example, you have a very, very quick sense of how many elements are not in parallel here. So you kind of have a good idea. These are 6 or 7 elements roughly that have this unique property here. Here are boundary detection examples. And so here we see that this is easy to do with hue, and that the shapes don't really distract us. There is a hierarchy of pre-attentive features, so not all of them are equal. We can see that the hue here is pretty clear. The shape here is pretty clear, but then here this is a little bit not as obvious where the boundary is, and so here in this case it is pretty obvious. So we see that hue is a stronger pre-attentive feature than the shape of the objects. How this works from a biology perspective is not quite known exactly, but there's a couple of different theories, and if you want to learn more about the theories behind that, I would just refer you to this link here. So why is this important for visualization? Well, it can be used to draw attention to areas of interest, like this highlighting method for search terms, for example. can be used to express similarity or group memberships. Like if you want to say these 5 elements belong together, you can use a pre-attentive property to highlight them, and then they are perceived as one. However, you must carefully design those visual features. It's not like, as you saw, if I have like a red, if I have a red circle in a sea of other red elements, I won't be able to spot it. So you have to think about how you design them, and you must avoid these conjunctions. And we will see these examples in focus and context techniques and in cues. So there's 3 minutes left. I'll maybe show you. Let's see. Yeah, we can do this. So change blindness is, we had color blindness, and this is now more something of attention. It's not about the biology, but it's that we cannot remember details of an image across separate scenes, except when we explicitly focus on an area. And then interruption between 2 scenes exacerbates this problem. And it's not really a vision of a failure of a vision system, but it's like inappropriate attention guidance. So here in this example, there's 2 different images. There's a difference between those 2 images. Like I'm showing you picture 1, blank, picture 2. Who can spot the difference? Raise your hands. There's 1 person, 5, 6 person. What do you see?
The shadow.
The shadow, yes. Then here in this picture, 1 person.
I don't know what it is though.
Yeah.
2. Okay, there's a couple now. And I'll show you. So this box is removed, and it's really hard to spot it if you have this distractor in the middle. What about this one? Nobody? 1, 2, 3.
No way.
So there's a couple of different theories about the causes. I don't want to go into details here, but it is dependent on your attention, on your expectation. For example, if you know that something will change, you will perceive it. And it's also of the semantic importance of an object in the scene. So if there's only 1 person in the picture, and you see this 1 person and it disappears, then it will, of course, you will notice it. But if it's something in the background, it's hard to change, hard to overlook. So low-level object properties are also overlooked more, more frequently. And so we'll continue next time with attention blindness and then go into data types.